Hi everyone, my name is Varun and I'm a DX engineer here at Chromatic. In this video, I'm going to give you a demo of some of the recently released features in Chromatic. So what's on the agenda? We are going to be talking about usage reports, which give you better insights into how you're using Chromatic and how much you're using it on different projects. We'll also be talking about Trace Viewer, which is a really handy new feature that allows you to debug any kind of rendering issues that you might be encountering with snapshots. And then speaking of snapshots, we're going to talk about a few new features that control the process of snapshotting. So auto pausing for GIFs and videos, ignore selectors, and cropping the snapshot to the viewport size. Then I'll give you a preview of a really exciting new feature called page shift detection. And then lastly, I'll share some resources around TurboSnap that make it easier to understand how TurboSnap works. All right, let's dive into it, starting with usage reports. So Chromatic has long given you information around how many bills were executed in a particular billing period. You've been able to download a CSV file with that data, which looks something like this. So you can see each bill that ran within that billing period, the build number associated with that, how many snapshots were captured, how many TurboSnaps were executed, which browsers he ran those tests on, and so on. So this has been pretty handy, but we wanted to take things up a notch. So we've introduced a new usage report section to the billing page. And this report has two sections, a usage section, which gives you a breakdown per project, how many snapshots and TurboSnaps were utilized, and then an invoice section, which includes, converts like the numbers that were used for the snapshots and TurboSnaps used for each project. How does that translate into what you were billed? So total number of snapshots that you might have in the plan that you selected, how many TurboSnaps were executed, if you went over the allocated amount in your plan, how does that convert into overages and so on. And then also you can download the CSV that I just shared from that page, but also download a PDF version of the invoice. So let me show you an example on one of our demo accounts. So I'm on the billing page for this account. Right up top, this is the currently active billing cycle. So if I click View Usage, I can see information around the different projects that I have on this account and how many snapshots and TurboSnaps that were used on each project. And then down here is the billing information. So because this is a currently active billing cycle, I can't download a PDF yet because you might have overages and so on. So you get that once the billing cycle is complete. So let's look at an example of that. So if I scroll down, I can view past statements. So let's open one of the past statements. And here you can see it does give me information on exactly how much I was charged in that billing cycle. And I can then go ahead and download the PDF invoice from here if I want to, or the CSV file, which gives me per build information for what happened during that billing cycle. So very handy if you are curious sort of how you're using Chromatic and want to get a bit more information around how Chromatic is being used across different projects. Cool. Moving on to the Trace Viewer. So this is a really handy tool for debugging snapshot issues. So if you've ever encountered snapshots that were blank or you were seeing inconsistent results every time you ran tests, this is a handy tool for debugging those issues. And the way it works is Chromatic in its capture cloud. So when you open up Storybook when you upload your Storybook to Chromatic to run tests, or whether you're using Chromatic with Cypress or Playwright, same idea. You upload a bunch of tests to Chromatic's capture cloud to run them in these cloud browsers and then capture snapshots. So that process in Chromatic's capture cloud is executed by Playwright. So not to be confused with if you're using Chromatic with Playwright, this is just something Chromatic uses under the hood in its own capture cloud to orchestrate the different browsers that are spun up to execute your tests. And because it's using Playwright, we can actually record that entire process, effectively giving you something that's kind of like developer tools you get in the browser, but recording the version of what was executed while the test was run. And then that gives you all kinds of helpful information like network activity, console logs, and DOM snapshots to debug exactly what happened in the cloud when the test was run to capture a particular snapshot. So let me show you an example. So here I ran a build on one of my demo projects, the meal drop project, which we often use to demonstrate chromatic features. And when I went to review the snapshots, I suddenly started seeing these diffs, which I was not expecting. And they were showing up on all of these different components, which I definitely did not touch. So the question was like, why exactly is this happening? And I have a hunch. Maybe it's something to do with the font. The font doesn't quite look right in the baseline versus the test that was just executed. So in order to debug something like this, I can use Trace Runner. And to get to the Trace Runner, what you have to do is you have to use this rerun build feature to run another build just on these stories that have diffs associated with them. And then in that subsequent build, you will have access to traces for each individual story. So in this particular case, I already ran the rerun build. So let's go to the build that came after. So in this rerun build, you can see there's a new column that appears in the test summary table with traces. And you will see a trace for each browser that you're running a particular test on. So let's go inspect what that trace looks like. So this is the trace for that particular story. Like I said, this is something that is generated by Playwright, which is used in Chromatic's Capture Cloud. But again, you can still use this feature regardless of whether you're using Chromatic with Storybook, Cypress, or Playwright. So cool. So here, effectively what I'm getting is a timeline of what happened on the server. So right from the server, the Chromatic Cloud, spun up a new browser, then went and visited this particular story, waited for the rendering to settle down, and then finally captured a snapshot. So here, what I'm seeing here is not just a snapshot, it's actual DOM. So I can go and inspect this and kind of see, what font is actually being applied here. So in this particular case, I can see a font family of Hind was applied to it through the CSS. So that tells me the CSS is working as I expect it to. But if I look at the rendered fonts, it's rendering Times New Roman. So yeah, something doesn't quite add up. So my CSS is working, but maybe the fonts aren't loading as I expect them to. So to figure that out, I can switch to the network tab. And what'll happen now is I can see right away there's a bunch of failed requests. And if I dig into it, these are WAF files, which are font files. So very clearly the font that I'm expecting to load is not loading, and that's what's causing this diff. Now, why is this happening? Maybe the URL that I'm using here is incorrect. Maybe I'm loading this from a third-party service, and the asset is not loading currently, or just unavailable. But what this tells me is the issue isn't in my code necessarily, but it's a static resource that I am expecting to load isn't loading. So okay, super handy to figure out exactly what's happening during the test, and if you're seeing a rendering that you're not expecting, this helps you figure out what's happening under the hood. So let me share another example. So here, I was working on a story to build out this dropdown. So the idea is you click on a button to open up this dropdown and select some value, and I actually have interaction tests set up to trigger this workflow. So when I ran the test for this particular story, I expected to see the dropdown open. But if I look at my story, it's just the button part. The dropdown isn't showing up. So again, to figure out what's happening, let's go back to this. I reran a build. So that's what you need to do to be able to get to the trace. So when I reran the build, I had traces available to me in the next build. So if I go into the next build, there it is. I have the trace available to me. And now if I go into this trace viewer, right away I can see that my interaction is working as I expect it to. The dropdown is open, but for some reason the snapshot is ignoring that. And what's happening here is we can go into the call tab to see the clip rectangle for the snapshot that's captured. And I can see that the clip rectangle has a height of 32 pixels, which doesn't quite seem right. So if I come and hover over this, and let's look at the root element inside my story. Oh, I can see it right away. It's 32 pixels. So what's happening is this dialog that's being rendered is just being ignored by the snapshot. And the reason that's happening is the dialog is rendered outside of the storybook root element. This is quite often the case if you're working with modals or dialogues. They tend to be rendered in the body tag, kind of like the last thing in the body tag, so that they show up above everything else. But the problem is Chromatic by default trims the snapshot for a story to the contents of the root element, so whatever is the intrinsic side of the root element. And because this dialog is outside of it, that's why it gets trimmed down to just the button part. So to solve this, it's pretty straightforward. You wrap your story in a decorator and give it a bit of a height so that that height accounts for the dropdown that's being open. So again, by jumping into this trace viewer, I was able to see exactly what's happening, whether it's an interaction issue, that my interactions aren't running the way I expect it to, or it's something else like the stories, the root element does not have an intrinsic height that accounts for the dialog that pops open. So super handy tool for dealing with all those rendering issues that you might be encountering. So if you want to learn more about this, hop on over to the troubleshooting snapshots page. And in here, we kind of go through the whole process of, if you encounter some kind of inconsistency, how do you run a rerun build to get to the trace? And then what kind of information are you getting in this trace in order to debug what's happening in that particular test? Awesome. Let's move on to some more snapshot related features. So this one is a pretty interesting one. So now Chromatic will just auto pause GIFs and videos that you might have in your UI. So I have an example of that right here. So I'm working with this particular card component. Has a few different variations. You can have image as a background. There's a sort of collapsed version of it, again with an image inside it. But also you can specify a video as a background. And then there you have two options here. You can specify a video as is, or you can specify a video with a poster. And what that means, if you're not familiar, is HTML videos allow you to specify a poster image, which shows up if the video is taking too long to download, or if the video fails to download for some reason, then it will just fall back to displaying that poster image. So what Chromatic will do now is, if you just have a video without a poster, it will pause at the first frame and consistently use that first frame in your visual tests. So each time you run the test, you shouldn't see any diffs associated with the video playback, like the video paused at frame 2 or frame 20 or something like that. It will always pause in the same place. But if you happen to specify a video with a poster image, it will use that poster image instead for the tests. So let's look at an example of this. So I took that component, ran those visual tests in Chromatic, and this is what it looks like. So this is the first test where I provided just a video without a poster image. So it's paused right at that first frame. And this is the second test where I provided a video with a poster image. So you can see it's using that poster image instead of a frame from the video. So again, really cool feature. It just means you don't have to worry about GIFs and videos if they are in your UI. Don't have to worry about figuring out how to pause them during visual testing. Chromatic will just do that for you automatically. And for GIFs, yeah, kind of the same idea. Just it will pause and use the first frame from the GIF animation. Moving on to ignore selectors. So quite often we have the scenario where you might have content that is being loaded from a CMS, or it might be an animation you can't pause for some reason, and you just want to ignore the contents of that that particular DOM node, but you still want to see if like the size of the DOM node changes or not. And so, for example, these category cards here, in your test, you might be pulling this data from a CMS, and that data might change all the time, and you don't want to worry about like the specifics of what's inside the card. The only thing you care about is if the dimensions of the card change for some reason or the layout changes. You want to track those diffs, but whatever's inside the card, you don't care about that. So the way we've been able to do this in Chromatic forever is using the data chromatic attribute, or by assigning the chromatic ignore class to a particular DOM node. And this is something that works across Storybook, Playwright, or Cypress. You're able to drop in this bit of code into your UI. So this goes into your actual app code, not the test. And whichever DOM node you assign it to, Chromatic will ignore the contents of that DOM node. But once again, if the size of the DOM node changes, then it will trigger a diff. So it's super handy for dealing with stuff that has dynamic content. Let's say if you're displaying a date and the date is constantly changing in the test, and you don't want to deal with mocking it, you can just hit go in and ignore the contents of that particular DOM node. So it won't trigger a diff every time the date changes. But this kind of works and is super handy. But a thing that we kept hearing from users was, sometimes I just want to ignore a whole bunch of different elements altogether and not have to go and attach this class or data attribute to every single element. And for that, we've introduced a new API called ignore selectors. So you can use the ignore selectors parameter to specify a list of CSS selectors that you want to target and ignore. So this can be any valid CSS selector. You can even specify multiple selectors that you want to ignore in a particular test. So here in Storybook, I'm applying it as a parameter to the chromatic object. In Playwright and Cypress, you would use the test configuration to apply ignore selectors. So what's happening here is every DOM node in a test that has the product price classes attached to it, Chromatic will just go ahead and ignore it. So I did that in my demo project here for the category cards that you see here. So let me show you what that looks like. So in my code, I set that at the root level, so at the global level, in Storybook preview.tsx file. So any story, any test in my Storybook that happens to encounter that card, I'm just going to go ahead and ignore the contents of that card. So let's see what that looks like in action. So right now I have a few different categories visible. I'll swap what's actually visible here. So I'm going to show this Thai and Indian categories and hide the sushi and Asian categories. So if I come back to my UI, you can see the UI has changed. The first two remain the same, but the others are, we've inserted these two and moved these two down to the end. So if I ran this test as is, without ignore selectors, you would see something like this, where first two would be the same, but everything else will trigger a diff. And that's something I don't want. I don't care about seeing the diff when there's content changes within those cards. So when I apply ignore selectors, what happens is, let's go back to find the right build. So this is the build that ran with ignore selectors. So this one doesn't have any diffs associated with that because I ignored the content changes. But let's go ahead and find a story for that homepage component where we're using the category cards. If I scroll down, you will notice that it has been updated to use the new content. But if I switch to snapshot, we were not seeing a diff because if you see this little yellow box here, it indicates that ignore selector was enabled for this particular test. And this is the selector that we're targeting. So there's a bit of a UI bug here. This yellow box should really be on all of these. But under the hood, Chromatic is ignoring the contents correctly. So super handy when you're dealing with dynamic content and you want to target a bunch of DOM nodes all at once with this new API. You can just specify a bunch of selectors that you want Chromatic to ignore. Cool. Moving on to crop to viewport. This is a bit of a niche one, but again, something that's worth covering. So by default, when you run a test in Chromatic, Chromatic captures the full height of the rendered UI. So you might have UI that goes beyond the visible viewport and requires the user to scroll. But in the test, Chromatic will just go through everything and capture the whole UI. So I actually have an example of that right here. This page, you go ahead and you pop open this dialog to add something to your cart. And at that point, it shows the drag backdrop, but the backdrop is only visible within the viewport. The stuff that is outside of the viewport, normally the user would scroll down to it. That stuff does get captured by Chromatic because, again, in most cases, when you're running a visual test, you kind of want to capture the entire UI. But there might be some cases where you feel like, I actually don't want to capture stuff beyond a particular height that I specify, and Chromatic should just crop my snapshot to that particular height. So the way you do that is a two-step process, and I'll show an example of that here. So this is the particular story where I want to go ahead and crop it to the viewport size. So step one is you have to assign a particular height to that story or that test. There's a few different ways to do it. The best way to do it is by using something called modes. If you're not familiar with modes, it's a very handy feature in Chromatic that allows you to render different variations of a test. So stuff like dark mode, light mode, different viewport sizes, and capture the same test with all of these variations applied to it. So in this particular mode, I'm applying the large mode to set the viewport to large size. And these modes are defined in this all modes file right here. So like I said, I have a couple of modes for light and dark themes and a bunch of modes that set viewport sizes. And these viewport sizes map to viewports I've configured inside Storybook. So if I go back to, let's pop into the Storybook that's live here. And this particular one is the one that I'm looking at. So here in the viewports add-on, I've configured a few different viewport sizes, so extra small, small, medium, large, and XL. And this sets both a width and a height for Storybook to restrict the story size to that particular viewport size. So once we assign that particular viewport size in a mode, again, that will control the width and specify a base height. But if the height of the UI extends beyond that height, Chromatic by default will capture the full UI. But if you want to crop it just to the specified height, the second thing you have to do is set crop to viewport to true. So two things. Step one, specify a particular viewport height using modes. And step two, set crop to viewport to true. So once I enabled both of these flags, I went ahead and ran another test. And this is what the second test looks like, where the first test, we captured the entire UI. Second test, the UI was cropped to the particular viewport size that you have specified. So again, a bit of a niche feature, but if you do want to specifically crop your snapshot to a specified height, this is how you do it. Cool. So those were the different snapshot features that I wanted to talk about. And moving on to another one that is snapshot related. And currently, this is something that we are testing out internally and hope to share it with you all soon. But yeah, it's a very, very exciting feature. And it's called page shift detection. And the idea behind it is quite often you modify a piece of UI by just inserting something into a page or removing a part of the page, and what happens is everything in the page just kind of shifts up and down, and it becomes kind of hard to figure out exactly what happened when you're looking at the diff, because you just see a big diff in the UI. And with page shift detection, Chromatic is actually going to analyze the UI to see, hey, what parts of the UI are the same and are they just shifting up and down? If they are, it's going to remove them from the diff and only highlight the bits that actually change. So the stuff that's in green is stuff that got inserted onto this page. Stuff that's in red is the stuff that got removed from this page. So let's look at an example of this. So I'll switch back to my storybook really quickly, and let's go to the homepage. So on this homepage, currently I have a few different sections: the hero, favorite pics, and the categories. But if I go back to my code and let's say decided to add a new section to talk about award-winning restaurants, so and then run tests on this, let's see what that test would look like if I was not using page shift. And it will look something like this. So everything up until the favorite pics part of the page looks the same. And then now I get a giant diff for everything below it because we inserted this new section right here, but then that shifted everything down and everything else is reported as a diff too. So this, depending on the size of your page, it gets really hard to figure out exactly what changed in the page. So now if I ran this same test with page shift enabled, this is what you'll see. You'll see that the stuff that just shifted down is not highlighted as a diff anymore, and only the bit that was inserted into the page gets highlighted as a diff, which makes your life much easier to figure out exactly what changed in the page. And I can actually show you these side by side, so you have a better idea of sort of what's happening. So on the left is page shift enabled, and on the right is without page shift. So you can see much larger diff, harder to figure out what's happening, and on the left with page shift, a more sort of specific diff that tells you exactly what was inserted into the view, into this story. So it's a really cool feature. Like I said, we're testing this internally right now and hope to share it with you all soon. Yeah, looking forward to that. And moving on, last thing I want to share is some learning resources around TurboSnap. Again, if you're not familiar with TurboSnap, TurboSnap is a really handy chromatic feature where, let's say if you have 50 stories in your storybook or 50 tests that you might be running. Sorry, actually this is a storybook specific thing, but so 50 stories in your storybook that you want to test. But when you changed code in a particular commit, it only impacted 5 stories. So with TurboSnap, Chromatic is able to figure out that only the code for only 5 stories were changed. So I only need to run and capture new snapshots for those 5 stories. But for the other 45 stories, I can reuse the same baseline as before. And the way this works is Chromatic uses Git history and uses the dependency graph that's generated by your build tool, so either Webpack or Vite, to analyze all the code changes to figure out exactly what changed and how does it map to specific tests that it's executing. Now, if you are new to Webpack or Vite or haven't had to deal with these build tools before, that idea of dependency tracing might be new, and it can be a little bit daunting, to be honest. So we put together this new guide that kind of walks you through, what exactly is dependency tracing, and it walks through the process for both Webpack and Vite, along with all the data that's generated by these two build tools to see, what's the raw data that's generated and how is it converted into data that is used by Chromatic for TurboSnap, with some examples. So this is a way for us to guide you through that process of understanding what is happening under the hood with TurboSnap. If you're hitting issues where you're not sure why TurboSnap decided to rebuild all the stories instead of just the ones with code changes, this will give you a good idea of sort of how that's working under the hood. And speaking of those full rebuilds, that's an important concept. In most cases, you want to run only run tests with code changes associated with it, but sometimes you want to run all of your tests. Things like when dependencies updated, or you changed storybook configuration, or maybe you changed some global CSS or a static asset. In those cases, with dependency tracing, it's pretty hard to tell that which parts of the code were impacted. It could be impacting a lot of other things that you're not expecting. So to be on the safer side, that's when Chromatic does a full rebuild and captures captures new baselines for all the tests. So when that happens, we convey that information to you through on the build page. You can go and hover over the TurboSnap icon to see exactly why a full rebuild was triggered. But also that CSV file that I talked about earlier, where you can download a CSV file with all the builds for a particular billing period. One of the columns there is TurboSnap bail reasons. In other words, why did TurboSnap run a full rebuild? And the values that you will see there are these sort of names that these properties that are highlighted in this particular section within the docs. So here we've went ahead and added descriptions to each of those sections. So when you are parsing that CSV file to see, why did TurboSnap run a full rebuild, you can have a better understanding sort of what's causing that full rebuild. So hopefully these two new resources will help you better understand TurboSnap and use it more effectively. And that covers everything I wanted to share today. Thank you for joining. If you want to contact me, you can find me on Blue Sky at varun.ca or on Twitter at Winker vs. Specs. Thanks again. Bye.